More than 300 million years ago, Earth was ruled by giant insects, endless swamp forests, and skies filled with creatures unlike anything alive today. Tonight, we're traveling back into the strange world of the Carboniferous to explore how these winged giants rose and why they vanished forever. Welcome to Sleepy Earth Channel. Before we begin, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight, and settle in for this journey into one of Earth's most forgotten worlds. More than 300 million years ago, long before the first bird crossed the sky or the first flower opened beneath sunlight, Earth was almost unrecognizable from the world you know today. The continents were still drifting toward each other, slowly assembling into the enormous supercontinent that scientists now call Pangaea. And across vast stretches of the planet, especially near the equator, the land had transformed into endless wetlands, so enormous they may have looked less like forests and more like living weather systems. Thick layers of warm mist hung above black water channels, tangled between towering plants unlike anything alive now. The air itself felt heavier, wetter, almost dense enough to taste. Even sunlight probably reached the ground differently here, filtered through gigantic forests of scale trees and primitive ferns, rising into dim green canopies that barely moved in the still atmosphere. This was the Carboniferous Period, a chapter of Earth's history so strange that even modern jungles feel tame beside it. And yet, what makes this lost world fascinating is not only how alien it appears, but how fragile it may have secretly been beneath its endless abundance. At first glance, the Carboniferous world seems almost peaceful. There were no roaring dinosaurs yet, no mammals, no birds singing in the trees. In fact, one of the eeriest details about this ancient planet may have been the silence. Modern forests are filled with constant noise, insects buzzing, birds calling, mammals moving through undergrowth. But in these ancient swamps, many familiar sounds did not exist yet. The forests creaked and dripped. Water moved slowly through dark channels. Massive fronds brushed together in humid winds. Somewhere in the distance, giant arthropods crawled across wet bark or through mats of decaying vegetation. But the world still lacked the complex chorus modern ecosystems produce today. Some paleontologists have suggested that if a human could somehow stand inside one of these forests, the silence itself might feel unsettling, almost dreamlike, as though the planet was still unfinished. And in many ways, it was. The Earth of the Carboniferous was still experimenting with life on land. Earlier periods had already seen plants and arthropods begin their move out of the oceans. But now, those ecosystems exploded across entire continents. The climate helped make this possible. Global temperatures were warm, and in many equatorial regions, rainfall remained extremely high for immense stretches of time. Instead of seasonal forests like those seen today, massive swamp systems expanded for millions of years without fully drying out. rivers frequently overflowed into lowlands. Organic material accumulated faster than it could decompose. Layer after layer of dead vegetation collapsed into dark, waterlogged ground, slowly compressing into the coal deposits humans would one day burn to power entire civilizations. In a strange way, many modern cities were built partly from the sunlight of this forgotten world. What is easy to miss, however, is how unusual these forests truly were. They were not forests of oak, pine, or maple. Grass did not yet cover the ground. Flowers had not evolved. Many of the tallest plants reproduced not with seeds, but with spores released into the thick, humid air like clouds of dust. Some of the most dominant trees, such as lepidodendron, looked less like modern trees and more like giant scaled pillars rising over 100 feet high. Their trunks carried strange diamond-shaped patterns left by fallen leaf structures, giving them an appearance almost reptilian under dim swamp light. Nearby stood giant horsetails and tree ferns, forming dense layers of vegetation and stagnant pools where oxygen levels in the water could suddenly collapse, creating deadly zones beneath the surface. Even decay itself worked differently here. Today, fungi and bacteria rapidly break down fallen wood, recycling forests back into soil. But during parts of the Carboniferous, some scientists believe decomposition processes had not yet fully adapted to handling the enormous volume of woody plant material spreading across the planet. As a result, dead vegetation accumulated at extraordinary scales. Entire forests collapsed into swamps and remained partially preserved instead of vanishing back into the ecosystem. This imbalance may have helped alter the atmosphere itself. Over immense spans of time, oxygen levels appear to have risen significantly higher than today. Some estimates suggest atmospheric oxygen may have exceeded 30%, compared to about 21% now, though exact numbers remain debated. If accurate, that difference could have changed nearly everything. Fires may have burned hotter and spread faster. Breathing may have felt different, and perhaps most famously, it may have allowed arthropods to reach gigantic sizes impossible in the modern world. Yet, even before those giant winged creatures appeared, the landscape itself already felt oversized. Many swamp systems stretched farther than any human could travel on foot in days. Thick fog rolled between towering plants, while shallow waterways reflected dark green skies overhead. During storms, lightning may have ignited oxygen-rich forests into infernos capable of consuming enormous regions before heavy rains eventually drowned the flames again. Scientists studying fossil charcoal from the Carboniferous have found evidence that wildfires were likely common despite the wet climate, a reminder that this world balanced abundance and destruction at the same time. That balance may explain why the Carboniferous feels strangely familiar despite being so alien. It was not a stable paradise. It was a living system under pressure, expanding rapidly, changing the atmosphere, reshaping coastlines, burying carbon, and transforming life itself in ways no species fully understood at the time. The forests were not consciously preparing the planet for future evolution, but they were quietly doing exactly that. Hidden inside those swamps were the conditions that would eventually help create reptiles capable of surviving far from water, and much later, the distant ancestors of mammals and humans. But at this stage in Earth's history, none of that future was visible yet. The planet still belonged to wet ground, shallow water, and the strange organisms thriving between them. One reason the Carboniferous continues to fascinate scientists is because it sits at a turning point where Earth almost feels trapped between two worlds. Earlier eras had been dominated largely by marine life, while later ages would belong to reptiles, dinosaurs, and eventually mammals. But the Carboniferous existed in the middle, when land ecosystems were still raw and unstable. Evolution had not yet settled on the familiar structures modern life uses today. Some lineages expanded into bizarre forms that later disappeared completely. Others remained small and insignificant for millions of years before suddenly becoming dominant much later. If you walked through these swamps, you would not necessarily know which species represented the future and which were evolutionary dead ends. That uncertainty gives the Carboniferous an almost haunting quality. It was a world full of possibilities that never survived. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how temporary it all was. Looking at fossil evidence today, it can feel as though these forests lasted forever. But in geological terms, even the Carboniferous was only a chapter. Climate patterns gradually shifted. Mountain ranges rose as continents collided. Some swamp ecosystems began fragmenting. Drier conditions spread into regions that had once remained permanently wet. The endless forests that dominated Earth for millions of years slowly lost their grip. Yet, during their peak, they transformed the planet so deeply that traces of their existence still surround modern civilization. Coal-fired electricity, industrial steel production, even parts of the modern global economy were built partly upon compressed remains of these ancient wetlands. Humanity lives alongside the residue of the Carboniferous every day, often without realizing it. There is something strangely humbling in that idea. The modern world, with all its technology and cities and satellites, still burns fragments of a swamp planet older than the dinosaurs. And somewhere inside those black layers of coal are the remains of forests that once stood beneath dim green skies while giant insects crawled through humid silence in a world that seemed eternal right before it disappeared. If you could stand somewhere inside the Carboniferous world and take a single deep breath, the first thing you might notice would not be the forests or the insects, or even the heat rising from the swamps. It might be the air itself. Not because it smelled strange, though it probably did, thick with wet vegetation and stagnant water, but because the atmosphere may have carried far more oxygen than modern humans are accustomed to breathing. Scientists still debate the exact numbers, yet many atmospheric models suggest oxygen levels during parts of the late Carboniferous could have climbed above 30%, dramatically higher than today's 21%. That difference sounds small at first, almost trivial, until you begin realizing how deeply oxygen controls nearly every system on Earth. Fire behavior changes, animal size changes, metabolism changes, even the chemistry of decay changes. The atmosphere is not just empty space surrounding life. It quietly determines the boundaries of what life can become. And for a period lasting millions of years, those boundaries may have expanded farther than almost any other time in Earth's history. The mystery is why it happened at all. Oxygen does not simply appear out of nowhere. It must be continuously produced and balanced against processes that consume it. For most of Earth's history, atmospheric oxygen remained far lower than modern levels, and earlier ecosystems were shaped around those limitations. But the Carboniferous swamps altered the balance in a way that may never have happened before or since on such a scale. Across enormous equatorial regions, forests spread relentlessly through warm wetlands under near constant rainfall. Plants pulled carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, using sunlight to build immense quantities of organic material. Normally, much of that material would eventually rot, returning carbon back into the air while consuming oxygen during decomposition. But something unusual appears to have interrupted that cycle. Many scientists suspect the vast swamp forests produced plant matter faster than Earth's decomposers could process it. Tree trunks collapsed into oxygen-poor wetlands, where decay slowed dramatically. Thick layers of dead vegetation accumulated beneath dark water, instead of fully breaking down. Over immense stretches of time, this trapped carbon became buried underground, eventually forming the coal deposits that define the Carboniferous itself. And every time carbon stayed buried, instead of returning to the atmosphere, oxygen levels could continue rising. In other words, the forests were slowly reshaping the planet, simply by refusing to disappear fast enough. That idea sounds almost absurd at human scale. Entire planetary chemistry systems altered because ancient wetlands buried too much wood. Yet fossil evidence strongly suggests something along those lines truly occurred. Massive coal seams found across North America and Europe trace back to these ancient swamp ecosystems, preserving compressed remnants of forests that once stretched across tropical lowlands near the equator. At the time, many regions now cold or temperate sat much closer to tropical zones due to continental drift. Places like present-day Pennsylvania or England may once have resembled endless, humid deltas under storm-filled skies. It is strange to imagine modern industrial societies built partly from the remains of a vanished atmospheric experiment. Some scientists have even proposed that the Carboniferous atmosphere may have represented one of the closest Earth ever came to becoming a true high-oxygen world. Yet even that possibility raises difficult questions. If oxygen levels became so high, why did the planet not simply erupt into unstoppable firestorms? Higher oxygen concentrations make combustion easier. Modern laboratory experiments show that materials ignite more readily when oxygen increases. Fossil charcoal from Carboniferous rocks confirms wildfires did occur, sometimes frequently. But the world did not burn continuously. Wetland conditions likely helped contain fires in many regions, while vast swamp systems acted almost like giant natural fire breaks. Some researchers suspect Earth hovered near a dangerous threshold where oxygen remained high enough to transform ecosystems without completely destabilizing them. Others argue oxygen estimates may be somewhat exaggerated, suggesting local variations rather than globally extreme levels. The truth is probably more complicated than any single explanation. Ancient atmospheres cannot be measured directly. Scientists reconstruct them using indirect evidence, such as charcoal abundance, isotope chemistry, and computer climate models, meaning uncertainty always remains. But even conservative estimates point toward a world breathing differently than ours. And once oxygen changed, life responded. Perhaps the most famous consequence appears in the arthropods. Insects and related creatures do not breathe through lungs like mammals. Instead, many rely on networks of tiny tubes called trachea that transport oxygen directly into their bodies. This system works efficiently at smaller sizes, but under modern oxygen conditions, it creates limits. Large bodies become harder to supply with enough oxygen internally. During the Carboniferous, however, higher atmospheric oxygen may have relaxed those limits. Suddenly, giant dragonfly relatives with wingspans approaching 2.5 feet became possible. Millipede-like arthropleura stretched longer than many humans are tall. Spiders, scorpions, and other arthropods may also have reached dimensions difficult to sustain today. Yet, size alone does not explain the deeper fascination surrounding these creatures. The real mystery is that Earth once allowed such forms to exist naturally. Modern humans often unconsciously assume the present world represents the normal version of nature. But the Carboniferous reminds us that ecosystems operate inside shifting planetary conditions. Change the atmosphere, and the definition of normal changes with it. Even the forests themselves may have felt physically different beneath elevated oxygen. Fires likely moved unpredictably. Some scientists speculate lightning storms could ignite explosive burns in dry pockets before heavy rains drowned the flames again. Breathing may have felt easier for large animals, though exact biological effects remain uncertain. Certain studies suggest increased oxygen can improve diffusion efficiency in tissues, but long-term exposure at very high levels may also create stresses for some organisms. Humans evolved under modern atmospheric conditions, so imagining how another oxygen regime truly felt remains difficult. The Carboniferous atmosphere may not have seemed dramatic moment to moment, but over evolutionary timescales, it quietly changed what organisms could attempt. Life expanded into ecological possibilities that later vanished when atmospheric conditions shifted again. And perhaps that is what makes this period feel so haunting. The giant insects were not monsters invading an otherwise familiar world. They were perfectly normal inhabitants of their environment. The atmosphere belonged to them. The forests belonged to them. Their existence only seems unnatural because modern Earth operates under different rules. There is also a deeper irony hidden beneath the Carboniferous oxygen story. The same processes that enriched the atmosphere may have eventually contributed to instability. As continents collided into larger land masses, mountain building altered weather systems and drainage patterns. Some swamp forests fragmented. Climate fluctuations intensified in certain regions. carbon cycles shifted again. Oxygen levels gradually declined from their peaks. As atmospheric conditions changed, the evolutionary advantages supporting gigantic arthropods may have weakened as well. New vertebrate groups also emerged, including early reptiles capable of reproducing away from water, opening ecological pathways less dependent on swamp environments. No single event appears responsible for ending the age of giant arthropods. Instead, the world slowly stopped being the kind of planet that favored them. And that slow transformation may feel more unsettling than sudden extinction. Entire ecosystems can vanish simply because the atmosphere drifts outside the range that once sustained them. Even today, Earth's atmosphere remains far less stable than it appears. Tiny changes in carbon dioxide, oxygen balance, or global temperature ripple through ecosystems in ways difficult to predict fully. The Carboniferous stands as a reminder that atmospheric chemistry is not background scenery. It is one of the hidden architects of evolution itself. Every forest, every animal body, every wildfire, every breath exists inside invisible limits shaped by the air surrounding them. More than 300 million years ago, those limits expanded just enough for Earth to briefly become a world of towering swamp forests and giant winged hunters moving through humid skies under clouds heavy with oxygen. And then, slowly, almost silently, the atmosphere changed again, taking that world with it. If you walked into a Carboniferous forest expecting something familiar, the first shock would probably come from realizing almost nothing around you actually looked like a modern tree. The landscape might still appear green from a distance, dense and overgrown beneath endless humidity. But as you moved deeper into the swamp, the illusion of familiarity would slowly fall apart. There were no oak branches spreading overhead, no pine needles carpeting the ground, no flowers adding color beneath the canopy. Even grass did not yet exist. Instead, the forests were filled with towering organisms that seem almost unfinished by modern standards, as though Earth had discovered how to build height before fully learning how to build forests the way we know them now. Giant scale trees rose upward like columns covered in reptilian patterns. Primitive horsetails, thick as telephone poles, clustered near stagnant water. Massive fern-like plants unfolded across wetlands under skies dimmed by mist and spores. The deeper you moved into this world, the more it might begin to feel less like nature and more like stepping inside an ancient biological experiment that no longer has a modern equivalent. One of the strangest details about these forests is that many of their dominant plants were not truly trees in the modern sense. Lepidodendron, one of the giants of the Carboniferous world, could grow over 100 feet tall, yet its structure differed dramatically from modern woody trees. Much of its trunk consisted of relatively soft tissue surrounding a narrow, supportive core, meaning some scientists believe these enormous plants may have grown quickly and lived comparatively short lives before collapsing into the swamp below. Their bark carried diamond-shaped scars left by fallen leaves, creating patterns that gave entire forests a textured appearance unlike anything alive today. In low light, especially through heavy fog, those trunks may have looked almost scaled or armored. Some paleobotanists have even noted how alien these forests appear compared to later ecosystems. Not simply because the species are extinct, but because the architecture of the forest itself followed different evolutionary rules. Modern forests evolved through hundreds of millions of years of competition, refinement, and adaptation. Carboniferous forests were still early attempts at building large terrestrial ecosystems, and that experimental quality can still be seen in the fossil record. Many plants reproduced through spores instead of seeds, releasing microscopic particles into the air in astonishing quantities. During certain seasons, the atmosphere may have carried clouds of drifting spores, thick enough to coat water surfaces and damp soil. Without flowers, fruits, or grasses, the forest floor probably lacked much of the color variation modern humans associate with plant life. Instead, the world was dominated by shades of deep green, black water, dark bark, and pale mist. Sunlight filtering through those canopies may have produced an almost underwater quality, muted and diffuse, rather than bright and sharp. And unlike modern forests, filled with birds moving through upper branches, much of the canopy remained eerily still, except for the movement of enormous insects and shifting fronds responding to heavy, humid air. What makes these forests particularly fascinating is that they were not simply ancient versions of modern ecosystems. They operated differently at nearly every level. Root systems spread through waterlogged ground, where oxygen levels could fluctuate unpredictably. Dead vegetation accumulated faster than decomposers could process it. Entire layers of fallen plant matter compressed beneath wetlands for millions of years, eventually becoming coal. In some regions, forests repeatedly flooded, died, regrew, and collapsed again, creating stacked geological layers that scientists still study today. These cycles preserved astonishing fossil records, allowing paleontologists to reconstruct not only individual species, but entire ecological patterns. Yet, even with that evidence, many uncertainties remain. Some Carboniferous forests may have looked dramatically different from others, depending on rainfall, elevation, and proximity to shifting river systems. Certain swamp regions likely became nearly impassable, choked with dense vegetation and unstable mud. Others may have opened into broad wetlands filled with shallow, reflective water beneath towering, spore-bearing plants. There is also growing evidence that these forests actively reshaped the atmosphere and climate around them. Their immense scale altered carbon cycles globally, contributing to rising oxygen levels while drawing enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In a sense, the forests were not passive scenery. They became planetary forces. The more they expanded, the more they transformed the environmental conditions supporting them. Yet there is something almost fragile hidden beneath that dominance. Many of these giant plants depended heavily on wet conditions. Unlike later seed-producing trees capable of surviving broader climates, numerous Carboniferous species thrived specifically in humid swamp environments. As long as wetlands remained stable, the forests spread aggressively. But once climate patterns shifted and drier conditions expanded into certain regions, many of these ancient lineages struggled to adapt. That vulnerability would eventually become important. Though at the height of the Carboniferous world, the forests must have seemed endless. Fossil evidence suggests some swamp systems stretched across enormous tropical lowlands for millions of years, creating one of the most productive ecosystems Earth had ever seen. Standing inside one of them might have felt timeless, as though the planet itself had become permanently green. Yet even in their peak abundance, signs of instability were already present. Fires periodically swept through portions of the landscape despite the humidity. Fossil charcoal preserved in Carboniferous rocks reveals that wildfires occurred far more often than many people once assumed. In oxygen-rich atmospheres, vegetation ignites more easily, meaning lightning strikes could transform sections of swamp forest into walls of fire before seasonal flooding drowned the flames again. This created a strange cycle of destruction and renewal. Burned forests collapsed into wetlands. Dead material accumulated underground. New growth spread across the ruins. Over immense spans of time, the process repeated again and again, slowly burying carbon beneath the earth while reshaping atmospheric chemistry above it. The forests were alive, but they were also constantly producing their own graveyards. And perhaps that is part of why the Carboniferous feels so haunting today. These ecosystems were simultaneously flourishing and preparing for disappearance. Another detail often overlooked is how physically difficult these forests may have been to move through. Modern forests typically contain established pathways formed by large animals, but during much of the Carboniferous, terrestrial vertebrates remained relatively limited in both size and diversity. Without large grazing mammals reshaping vegetation, plant growth may have become overwhelmingly dense in many areas. Fallen trunks decayed slowly in oxygen-poor wetlands, creating tangled layers beneath shallow black water. Giant horsetails formed thick clusters near marsh edges. Mud could suddenly swallow weight beneath seemingly stable surfaces. Some researchers suspect portions of these ecosystems were extremely difficult for larger animals to cross, almost maze-like in their density. In that sense, the Carboniferous forest may have functioned less like a park and more like a living obstacle course built by uncontrolled plant expansion. Yet hidden inside that suffocating vegetation was one of the most important evolutionary transitions in Earth's history. These forests helped create the environmental pressures and opportunities that pushed animals farther onto land. Arthropods thrived among the damp vegetation. Early amphibians moved through waterways and muddy edges. Primitive reptiles slowly emerged with adaptations allowing reproduction away from standing water. The swamps became laboratories for terrestrial life. But at the same time, they also trapped enormous amounts of carbon underground, cooling parts of the planet over geological timescales and helping destabilize the very ecosystems responsible for that change. It is one of the great paradoxes of the Carboniferous world. The forests became so successful that they may have helped alter the atmosphere and climate enough to undermine their own long-term dominance. Looking at fossilized trunks today, preserved inside stone after more than 300 million years, there is a strange sense that these plants belonged to a version of Earth that no longer exists in any form. Modern rainforests can feel ancient, but they are built from evolutionary systems far more familiar to humans. Carboniferous forests existed before flowers, before birds, before mammals, before the sounds and colors modern ecosystems take for granted. They were darker, wetter, quieter, and in some ways more alien than the dinosaur world that came after them. And somewhere high above those endless swamps, giant insects were beginning to move through the humid skies, taking advantage of an atmosphere and a forest structure unlike anything the Earth would ever produce again. At some point, inside the endless humidity of the Carboniferous world, the sky stopped belonging only to drifting spores and storm clouds. Something else began moving above the swamp forests, weaving silently between giant fern canopies and towering scale trees. Not birds, not bats. Those creatures would not exist for hundreds of millions of years. The first rulers of Earth's skies were insects, and during the Carboniferous period, some of them became so large that modern humans would probably struggle to process them at first glance. A dragonfly relative called Meganeura may have carried a wingspan approaching 2.5 feet, roughly the size of a hawk. Other flying arthropods grew to dimensions almost impossible under modern atmospheric conditions. And perhaps the strangest part is that these creatures were not rare anomalies hidden in isolated environments. They were part of functioning ecosystems. The Carboniferous atmosphere, forests, and climate had briefly aligned in a way that allowed insects to push far beyond the limits familiar today. To understand how unsettling that world may have felt, it helps to imagine the scale correctly. Modern dragonflies already move with astonishing precision. Their flight systems allow rapid acceleration, hovering, backward movement, and sudden directional changes that even advanced aircraft engineers have studied for inspiration. Now imagine those movements performed by something large enough for its wings to produce an audible, rhythmic pulse through humid air. In the dim light beneath Carboniferous clouds, giant wings may have flashed between layers of swamp mist before vanishing again into dense vegetation. Some scientists believe Meganeura likely hunted smaller arthropods and primitive amphibians near waterways, much like modern dragonflies patrol ponds and marshes. But unlike today's dragonflies, these predators occupied a sky with almost no vertebrate competition. Birds had not evolved. Pterosaurs were still unimaginably far in the future. For a brief geological window, the atmosphere above Earth's forests belonged almost entirely to giant arthropods. And that may have shaped the evolution of life on land more than most people realize. The rise of these giant insects was probably not caused by a single factor. Oxygen levels almost certainly played a major role, but ecosystems are rarely that simple. Higher atmospheric oxygen likely made it easier for arthropods to support larger bodies through their tracheal breathing systems, where oxygen diffuses through networks of tubes rather than being pumped by lungs. Under modern oxygen concentrations, this design imposes physical constraints as size increases. But during the Carboniferous, those constraints may have loosened enough to open evolutionary possibilities unavailable today. Yet oxygen alone does not automatically create giant predators. the environment also offered something equally important: opportunity. The swamp forests created enormous habitats filled with moisture, plant matter, insects, and small vertebrates. With no birds controlling the skies and relatively few large terrestrial predators compared to later periods, arthropods expanded into ecological roles that would later be occupied by completely different groups of animals. In a way, the Carboniferous atmosphere did not simply allow insects to grow larger, it temporarily allowed insects to become something closer to aerial apex predators. Fossil evidence suggests Meganeura and related griffinflies possessed long, narrow bodies and huge wings supported by intricate vein networks, similar in some respects to modern dragonflies, but not identical. Their exact flight style remains debated. Some researchers believe they were powerful, active flyers capable of rapid pursuit. Others suspect their size may have limited maneuverability compared to smaller, modern dragonflies, forcing them into more gliding-based hunting strategies. Without living descendants large enough for direct comparison, many details remain uncertain. But even the uncertainty adds to the fascination. These were not simply oversized versions of modern insects. They belonged to evolutionary branches adapted to atmospheric conditions that no longer exist. And because of that, parts of their biology may remain permanently mysterious. Their vision, however, was almost certainly extraordinary. Modern dragonflies possess some of the most advanced visual systems in the insect world, capable of tracking movement with incredible speed and precision. If giant Carboniferous relatives shared similar capabilities, they may have functioned as terrifyingly efficient aerial hunters inside the swamp forests. Imagine standing near a black water channel while humid fog drifts between giant horsetails, then suddenly hearing the low, mechanical flutter of enormous wings overhead. The predator itself might appear only for seconds before vanishing again into mist and shadows. In some ways, these insects may have made the Carboniferous sky feel more alive than modern skies. Today, large flying animals are relatively uncommon outside birds, but during the Carboniferous, flying arthropods likely filled the air above wetlands in enormous numbers, moving through ecosystems still in the early stages of terrestrial evolution. Yet giant flight creates problems as well as advantages. Larger wings require more energy. Heavier bodies become vulnerable to changes in temperature and oxygen availability. Storms inside Carboniferous climates may have been especially dangerous. The same humid atmosphere supporting giant insects could also produce violent weather systems over swamp lowlands. Some scientists speculate that giant arthropods may have relied heavily on stable, warm conditions near equatorial regions, limiting how far they could spread into harsher environments. Others argue their fossil record may underrepresent their true diversity because swamp ecosystems preserve remains differently depending on local conditions. Even now, researchers continue debating how common giant flying arthropods truly were across the planet. And then there is the deeper question hiding underneath all of this. Why did evolution never produce giant insects again after the Carboniferous and early Permian periods? Oxygen decline is often presented as the primary answer, but the timing may not fully explain everything. As vertebrates evolved more advanced flight systems and predatory behaviors, arthropods may have faced increasing competition and pressure from entirely new ecological threats. The skies gradually stopped being safe for giant insects. Faster predators emerged. Ecosystems diversified. Atmospheric chemistry shifted. What once worked no longer worked the same way. It is possible the Carboniferous represented not just a moment of high oxygen, but a rare overlap where multiple environmental conditions briefly aligned at once. Remove even one of those conditions, and the age of giant winged arthropods begins fading from Earth's ecosystems. There is also something psychologically strange about giant insects specifically. Humans often react to insects differently than to large mammals or reptiles. Even small insects trigger instinctive responses in many people because their movements, anatomy, and behavior feel unfamiliar compared to vertebrates. Scaling those creatures upward changes the emotional atmosphere entirely. A giant reptile may feel dangerous, but a giant dragonfly or millipede often feels uncanny in a different way, almost as though the proportions of nature itself have shifted incorrectly. The Carboniferous world may have carried that unsettling quality constantly. Forests already looked alien. The air behaved differently. The atmosphere smelled of wet decay and spores. And above it all moved enormous arthropods with compound eyes reflecting dim green light beneath storm clouds. Yet despite how monstrous they appear through modern imagination, these creatures were not failures or accidents. They were highly successful organisms adapted perfectly to their environment. The Carboniferous was their world, not ours. That distinction matters because it changes how the period should be understood. These giant insects were not primitive stepping stones waiting for better animals to evolve. They represented one valid outcome of Earth's environmental conditions at the time. If atmospheric chemistry and evolutionary pressures had unfolded differently, perhaps arthropods might have remained dominant far longer than they did. It is even possible that the modern world would look radically different if Carboniferous conditions had persisted. The fact that giant insects vanished does not mean they were inferior. It simply means the planet changed. And the more scientists study Earth's history, the clearer it becomes that ecosystems are shaped less by permanence than by temporary windows of possibility. During the Carboniferous, one of those windows opened above the swamp forests. Oxygen rose. Wetlands spread. Predatory vertebrates remained limited. And for millions of years, giant insects filled the skies of a world still learning what life on land could become. Deep beneath the towering swamp forests of the Carboniferous world, below the drifting spores and giant wings moving through humid skies, something even stranger crawled across the dark ground. It did not fly. It did not roar. In fact, if you saw it emerging slowly through wet vegetation, the most unsettling detail might be how quiet it seemed for a creature so enormous. Arthropods, one of the largest arthropods ever known to walk on land, could stretch more than 8 feet long, with a segmented armored body moving across the forest floor like a living train of polished black plates. Modern millipedes are small enough to fit in your hand. Arthropods belong to the same distant lineage. Yet, In the Carboniferous environment, evolution pushed that body design to sizes so extreme that early fossil discoveries left scientists struggling to understand what they were even looking at. Some of the first remains were mistaken for giant reptile tracks or fragments of unknown animals because nothing in the modern world truly prepares the mind for a terrestrial arthropod the size of a crocodile. And perhaps that is what makes Arthropleura so fascinating even today. It was not simply large. It represented a version of Earth where the boundaries between possible and impossible operated differently. Imagine the Carboniferous forest at ground level rather than from above. The air is thick and damp beneath towering fern-like plants. Pools of black water reflect dim green light filtering through layers of ancient vegetation. Fallen trunks lie half submerged in mud, where decay moves slowly through oxygen-poor wetlands. The ground itself is unstable in places, layered with soft plant matter accumulated over centuries. Then, somewhere ahead, hidden beneath mist and shadows, dozens of articulated legs begin moving in slow, synchronized waves through the undergrowth. Arthropleura probably did not move quickly by the standards of active predators, but speed may not have mattered. At full size, it dominated the forest floor simply through scale alone. Fossil trackways discovered in places like Scotland suggest some individuals traveled across muddy surfaces, leaving trails nearly a foot wide. Those traces remain among the largest terrestrial invertebrate trackways ever found. And what is especially remarkable is that they appear in ecosystems still relatively early in the history of complex life on land. The Earth had barely begun experimenting with large terrestrial ecosystems, and already it was producing arthropods larger than many modern mammals. Yet, despite its intimidating appearance, scientists still debate exactly how dangerous Arthropleura really was. For decades, popular depictions often imagined it as a giant predator stalking Carboniferous swamps, partly because modern humans instinctively associate large arthropods with threat. But fossil evidence tells a more complicated story. Its mouth parts do not appear especially suited for active predation, and some researchers believe Arthropleura may have fed primarily on decaying plant matter, spores, or soft vegetation scattered across swamp floors. If true, that creates an almost surreal image. One of the largest land arthropods in Earth's history may have lived more like an enormous armored recycler, quietly processing forest debris beneath the giant trees. Still, uncertainty remains. Fossil preservation from the Carboniferous is incomplete, and soft tissues rarely survive. It is possible Arthropleura occupied a more flexible ecological role than any single category suggests. Some scientists argue that even primarily herbivorous arthropods of that size could become opportunistic feeders when conditions allowed. Others note that the swamp ecosystems themselves may have supported food webs unlike anything modern analogies fully capture. The truth may never be known with certainty, but perhaps that mystery is fitting for a creature from such an alien world. Arthropleura existed in a time before terrestrial ecosystems settled into the patterns familiar today. One reason Arthropleura could become so massive may once again connect back to the Carboniferous atmosphere. Higher oxygen concentrations likely made large arthropod bodies more viable, especially for organisms relying on diffusion-based respiratory systems. But oxygen alone cannot explain the full picture. The Carboniferous forests also provided immense quantities of organic material and relatively few large vertebrate competitors. Large mammalian herbivores did not yet exist. Reptiles were only beginning to diversify. In many swamp systems, giant arthropods occupied ecological spaces that later periods would fill with completely different kinds of animals. The forest floor belonged to them. And because terrestrial ecosystems were still developing, evolutionary competition may have operated differently than it does now. Arthropleura did not need to compete against herds of grazing mammals or packs of fast-moving vertebrate predators. It evolved in ecosystems where arthropods themselves remained among the dominant large terrestrial organisms. There is also something strangely mechanical about the way Arthropleura must have moved. Modern millipedes already create hypnotic wave-like motion as hundreds of legs coordinate beneath segmented bodies. Scaled up to enormous size, that movement may have appeared almost unnatural beneath swamp fog. Some paleontologists suspect Arthropleura could raise portions of its body higher than modern millipedes due to its size and rigid exoskeleton structure. Others believe its movement remained relatively low and sweeping, designed more for stability on wet ground than speed. Fossil trackways occasionally show long, uninterrupted paths through muddy terrain, suggesting these animals could travel considerable distances across Carboniferous landscapes. But even those traces raise questions. Were they migrating between swamp systems? Searching for mates? Escaping floods or fires? The fossil record preserves movement without preserving intention. We see where they went, but not why. And that absence creates a strange emotional gap in paleontology. Entire worlds become visible only through fragments. Another unsettling possibility is how vulnerable giant arthropods may have been despite their size. Exoskeletons provide protection, but they also create challenges. Arthropods must molt as they grow, temporarily becoming soft and exposed. For a creature as large as Arthropleura, molting may have been an especially dangerous process. Some scientists speculate giant arthropods required highly stable, humid environments, partly because drying out during vulnerable stages could become catastrophic. Carboniferous swamps, with their constant moisture and dense vegetation, may have created exactly the environmental conditions necessary to support such enormous invertebrates. But that dependence also meant environmental shifts could quickly become dangerous. As climates changed later in Earth's history and swamp systems fragmented, creatures like Arthropleura may have lost the stable ecosystems they depended on. Their disappearance was not necessarily sudden or dramatic. The world simply became less suited for animals built under Carboniferous conditions. And perhaps that gradual fading feels more haunting than a violent extinction event. Arthropleura did not vanish because it failed. It vanished because the planet changed its rules. What makes these giant arthropods particularly important is that they reveal how unfamiliar Earth's history truly is compared to modern assumptions. Today, large land animals are almost always vertebrates: mammals, reptiles, birds. Arthropods dominate in number, but rarely in body size. The Carboniferous reversed that balance in remarkable ways. Giant insects filled the skies. Massive, segmented creatures ruled the forest floor. Vertebrates remained comparatively limited and experimental. It was a world where the future dominance of reptiles and mammals was not yet obvious. Evolution had not committed to the paths modern humans now see as inevitable. In fact, if atmospheric chemistry and ecological pressures had shifted differently, Earth's later history might have unfolded in ways almost impossible to predict. Some scientists even argue that arthropods reached their terrestrial peak during this era, before vertebrate competition gradually reshaped ecosystems around the globe. Standing inside those forests, however, no creature would have recognized itself as part of a temporary age. Arthropleura crawled through swamp shadows without knowing its world represented a brief evolutionary window that would never return. The forests still stretched endlessly beneath humid skies. Giant insects still moved overhead. The atmosphere still carried more oxygen than modern Earth. Yet beneath all that apparent stability, deeper planetary changes were already beginning. Continents continued colliding. Climates slowly fluctuated. Ecosystems shifted almost invisibly over millions of years. And eventually, the conditions supporting giant arthropods weakened enough that the Earth quietly closed the door on creatures like Arthropleura forever. Today, all that remains are fossilized plates, ancient trackways pressed into stone, and the unsettling realization that long before humans imagined monsters crawling through forgotten worlds, Earth had already created them naturally, in silence, beneath the swamps of the Carboniferous. While the swamp forests of the Carboniferous world spread across the continents under thick, humid skies, another world existed beyond them, darker, deeper, and in some ways, even stranger. The oceans of the Carboniferous were not empty spaces surrounding the land. They were vast, unstable systems shaped by fluctuating oxygen, shifting coastlines, rising mountain chains, and ecosystems still recovering from ancient extinctions long before the age of dinosaurs began. If the forests above ground felt alien, the seas may have felt almost prehistoric, even by prehistoric standards. Much of the coastline did not resemble modern beaches with clean waves and bright sand. Instead, shallow tropical seas flooded lowlands beneath heavy storm systems, while enormous river networks carried dark organic material from the swamps into coastal waters. In some places, the ocean may have appeared murky green or nearly black beneath cloudy skies, filled with suspended sediments, decaying plant matter, and blooms of microscopic life feeding on nutrient-rich runoff from the endless wetlands inland. These were seas connected directly to the breathing machinery of the Carboniferous forests, and because of that connection, the oceans became part of the same planetary experiment transforming Earth's atmosphere above. One of the most fascinating things about Carboniferous oceans is how unstable oxygen levels may have been beneath the surface. While atmospheric oxygen increased dramatically on land, some marine environments appear to have suffered from the opposite problem. Fossil and sediment evidence from certain regions suggests parts of the seafloor periodically became oxygen poor or even nearly lifeless. Modern scientists call these conditions anoxia, and they can create strange ecosystems where only specialized organisms survive. In stagnant, deeper waters, oxygen may have disappeared almost completely, while decaying organic material accumulated layer after layer in darkness below. This created sharp contrasts across the marine world. Near shallow, sunlit reefs, life flourished in warm, tropical waters. But farther below, entire zones may have become suffocating dead regions where almost nothing large could survive for long. The Carboniferous oceans were not uniformly alive. They were fragmented, unpredictable, and chemically restless. And perhaps that instability explains why marine ecosystems from this era feel so mysterious compared to later prehistoric seas dominated by giant reptiles. The oceans of the Carboniferous belonged primarily to fish, sharks, invertebrates, and ancient lineages that modern oceans barely remember anymore. Sharks, in particular, were diversifying rapidly during this time, though many looked nothing like the sleek predators familiar today. Some possessed bizarre jaw structures unlike anything in modern marine life. One of the strangest was helicoprions' distant relatives and other unusual cartilaginous fish, experimenting with body forms that later disappeared completely. Yet even among these early sharks, uncertainty remains everywhere. Many species are known only from isolated teeth or fragments because cartilage fossilizes poorly. Entire predators may have ruled Carboniferous waters while leaving behind only scattered clues pressed into stone. That incomplete record creates an eerie feeling when studying the period. The oceans seem filled with shadows of creatures science can only partially reconstruct. And, unlike dinosaurs, whose skeletons often survive dramatically intact, much of Carboniferous marine life exists as fragments and impressions, as though the sea itself tried to erase them. The shallow tropical seas covering parts of ancient continents were likely among the richest ecosystems of the time. Coral-like reef systems expanded through warm water, though many reef builders differed from modern corals. Crinoids, brachiopods, ammonoid relatives, and dense invertebrate communities spread across marine shelves beneath shifting currents. In some places, the sea floor may have appeared crowded almost beyond imagination with filter-feeding organisms attached to rock, mud, or reef structures. Fossil beds from the Carboniferous often preserve astonishing concentrations of marine life packed together in layers, evidence of ecosystems operating at immense scale for millions of years. Yet, there was also something fragile hidden beneath that abundance. Changes in sea level repeatedly transformed these environments. As glaciers expanded and retreated in parts of the southern hemisphere during late Carboniferous ice ages, global sea levels fluctuated dramatically. Shallow seas advanced inland and then withdrew again over enormous regions. Entire marine habitats appeared and vanished across geological time like breathing tides lasting millions of years. That instability shaped evolution constantly. Species adapted, migrated, or disappeared as coastlines shifted beneath them. Some researchers believe these repeated environmental disruptions may have accelerated diversification in certain marine groups while destabilizing others. Even the oceans themselves were not fixed landscapes. They kept rearranging the map of life. And then there were the predators moving through those dark waters. Large fish hunted beneath murky surfaces where visibility may have been limited by sediment and algae blooms. Ancient shark relatives cruised through coastal channels connected directly to swamp deltas. Some freshwater systems stretched deep into tropical wetlands, blurring the boundary between river and sea. Primitive amphibians occasionally entered these environments, while early vertebrates experimented with new ecological roles near shorelines. The Carboniferous world often feels divided between land and ocean in modern imagination, but in reality, the boundary was probably messy and unstable. Flooded forests, coastal marshes, and shallow inland seas merged into enormous transitional zones where marine and terrestrial ecosystems constantly interacted. During storms, rivers carried plant debris far into coastal waters. Dead marine organisms washed back into swamps. Nutrients cycled endlessly between environments. In a sense, the Carboniferous planet functioned less like separate ecosystems and more like one enormous, connected, wet world. Some scientists have suggested that dark, organic-rich waters may also have influenced marine visibility and oxygen circulation in unusual ways. Warm climates combined with high nutrient input can trigger explosive microbial growth, which eventually consumes oxygen as organisms decay. In modern oceans, similar processes sometimes create dead zones near river deltas. During the Carboniferous, with vast swamp systems feeding immense quantities of organic matter into coastal environments, certain marine basins may have experienced these conditions repeatedly at large scales. That possibility paints a far more unsettling image of the ancient seas than the bright blue prehistoric oceans often shown in popular media. Some Carboniferous waters may have looked thick, dim, and heavy beneath overcast skies, carrying the scent of decay from forests stretching beyond the horizon. Yet, despite those harsh conditions, life kept expanding into new forms. That tension between abundance and instability seems to define nearly every part of the Carboniferous world. Even extinction operated differently here. Unlike the sudden asteroid impact that would later end the age of dinosaurs, many Carboniferous changes unfolded slowly across millions of years. Marine ecosystems shifted gradually as climates cooled, sea levels fluctuated, and continents collided into larger land masses. Some species adapted successfully. Others vanished so quietly that their disappearance survives only as gaps in fossil layers. There is something almost unsettling about extinction happening slowly enough that no individual creature would ever understand the world was ending around it. Entire ecosystems can fade not through catastrophe, but through changing chemistry, altered coastlines, and environments drifting beyond the limits life evolved to tolerate. The Carboniferous oceans may have experienced exactly that kind of slow transformation. Looking into those ancient seas today through fossil evidence feels almost like staring through murky water itself. Shapes emerge briefly, then disappear again into uncertainty. Scientists reconstruct fragments of reef systems, isolated shark teeth, ancient fish scales, and chemical signatures trapped inside stone. From those pieces, a picture begins forming of oceans far darker and stranger than the later reptile-filled seas of the Mesozoic era. These waters belong to an earlier Earth, one still experimenting with large-scale ecosystems while atmospheric oxygen climbed above swamp forests inland. Giant insects ruled humid skies. Massive arthropods crawled through wetlands. And offshore, beneath black water reflecting storm clouds, ancient sharks and forgotten marine lineages moved through unstable oceans shaped by the same forces slowly transforming the entire planet. For millions of years, the Carboniferous world seemed to belong almost entirely to wetlands. Giant arthropods crawled through forests soaked in humidity. Amphibian-like predators lurked beside blackwater channels. Life remained tied to rivers, swamps, floodplains, and the endless dampness covering much of the planet's equatorial regions. But hidden quietly beneath all of that abundance, something profoundly important was beginning to change. Small creatures, easy to overlook at the time, were slowly developing one of the most revolutionary adaptations in the history of life on Earth. They were the earliest reptiles, though they did not yet resemble the reptiles modern humans imagine. No towering dinosaurs existed yet, no giant crocodilian hunters. These first reptile-like animals were often small, cautious, and physically unimpressive beside the massive swamp ecosystems surrounding them. Yet inside their bodies was a biological innovation that would eventually reshape the planet more completely than the giant insects or forests ever could. For most earlier vertebrates living on land, reproduction still depended heavily on water. Amphibians could move across forests and hunt on shorelines, but their eggs remained vulnerable to drying out. Moist environments were not simply preferred habitats, they were essential for survival. That dependence trapped much of early terrestrial life near wetlands and rivers. But the first true reptiles, or at least the earliest amniotes from which reptiles later emerged, carried something radically different. Eggs, protected by specialized membranes capable of retaining moisture and supporting development away from open water. It sounds almost simple now, but that adaptation may have changed the direction of evolution more than nearly any other event of the Carboniferous world. Suddenly, vertebrates were no longer completely chained to swamps. They could begin exploring drier landscapes that earlier animals struggled to dominate. And once that boundary disappeared, the future of Earth's ecosystems quietly began shifting beneath the forests. What makes this transition especially fascinating is how invisible it probably looked at first. There was no dramatic moment when reptiles suddenly took over the world. The Carboniferous forests still towered across tropical regions. Giant insects still filled the skies. Arthropleura still moved through swamp shadows. But among fallen vegetation and muddy riverbanks, small, reptile-like creatures were gradually gaining freedoms earlier vertebrates never possessed. Some of the earliest known examples, such as Hylonomus, were relatively tiny animals that may have resembled slender lizards to modern eyes, though they were far more primitive than any living reptile today. Fossils discovered inside ancient tree stump cavities suggest some may have sheltered among dense swamp vegetation while hunting insects and other small prey. Their world remained dangerous and unstable, Yet they carried within them the evolutionary blueprint for a future where vertebrates would eventually dominate nearly every terrestrial environment on Earth. There is something deeply unsettling about realizing that the rise of reptiles began not through overwhelming strength, but through flexibility. The Carboniferous world rewarded creatures capable of surviving away from constant moisture. As climates slowly shifted and some regions became less stable, those advantages grew more important. Early amniotes could travel farther from wetlands without risking reproductive collapse. They could exploit habitats inaccessible to many amphibians. And because their eggs protected developing embryos internally from drying conditions, entire ecosystems gradually opened before them. The swamp world was no longer the only world available. That subtle shift may have altered evolutionary competition across the planet. And perhaps the strangest part is that the forests themselves may have unintentionally helped create the conditions favoring this transition. The same carboniferous ecosystems that raised oxygen levels and supported giant arthropods also trapped enormous amounts of carbon underground through buried plant matter. Over geological timescales, these processes likely influenced climate cooling and environmental fluctuations. Wetlands fragmented in some areas, seasonal variation increased in others. Stable swamp dominance slowly weakened. As that happened, animals capable of surviving outside constantly humid environments gained advantages that earlier terrestrial vertebrates lacked. In a sense, the Carboniferous forests may have indirectly prepared the conditions for the rise of the creatures that would eventually outlast them. The early reptiles themselves were probably not impressive hunters by later standards. Many remained small-bodied and vulnerable to larger amphibians or predatory arthropods. But evolution rarely cares about immediate spectacle. It rewards survival across changing environments. And the first reptiles carried exactly the kind of adaptations that become powerful when ecosystems begin destabilizing. Their skin reduced water loss more effectively than amphibian skin. Their eggs functioned like portable aquatic environments enclosed within protective membranes. Some researchers believe these innovations allowed early reptiles to become more active during drier periods when amphibians faced increasing stress. Others argue the transition may have been slower and more regionally variable than traditionally imagined. Fossil evidence from the Carboniferous remains incomplete, and distinguishing the exact evolutionary relationships between early amniotes can still be surprisingly difficult. Yet, regardless of classification debates, one reality remains clear. Vertebrate life on land was beginning to break free from permanent dependence on swamps. And once that happened, Earth's future changed permanently. Imagine the Carboniferous landscape during this transition. Vast wetlands still dominate the horizon beneath humid clouds, but scattered beyond them are increasingly dry patches of forest floor, elevated ridges, and seasonal environments where moisture fluctuates unpredictably. Amphibians remain strongest near rivers and marshes, but small, reptile-like creatures begin exploring farther outward into unstable terrain, where earlier vertebrates struggled to reproduce consistently. The change is subtle enough that no single generation would recognize it as revolutionary. Yet, over millions of years, these small expansions accumulate into enormous evolutionary consequences. reptiles diversify. Their descendants adapt to harsher climates. Eventually, some lineages become enormous. Others return to the oceans. Some evolve powered flight. Much later, one distant branch produces birds, while another mammal-like branch eventually leads toward humans. All of that future remains hidden inside these tiny Carboniferous pioneers moving cautiously through wet undergrowth beneath giant insects. That contrast creates one of the most fascinating emotional tensions in Earth's history. The Carboniferous world often appears dominated by gigantic forms, massive forests, giant arthropods, oxygen-rich skies. Yet the true long-term winners of the era may have been among the smallest and least visually dramatic animals alive at the time. Evolution does not always favor the largest creatures in the moment. Sometimes it favors the organisms best prepared for conditions that do not exist yet. The first reptiles may represent one of the clearest examples of that principle anywhere in the fossil record. Another detail often overlooked is how psychologically different the world must have become once vertebrates gained greater independence from wetlands. Earlier ecosystems remained concentrated heavily around water because reproduction required it. But reptiles began loosening that restriction. Life could spread more confidently into interior regions, away from swamps and rivers. Over immense spans of time, this likely altered predator-prey relationships, migration patterns, vegetation pressure, and ecosystem structure itself. In a way, the Carboniferous world had accidentally unlocked terrestrial freedom for vertebrates, and once unlocked, it could never truly be reversed. Yet, during the late Carboniferous itself, none of this future dominance was obvious. Giant dragonflies still crossed swamp skies. Arthropods still crawled through dark forests. Ancient sharks still moved through black coastal waters. The planet still felt ancient, humid, and overwhelmingly ruled by arthropods and wetlands. But beneath that surface, the balance had already begun changing. Small reptiles carried the possibility of a different Earth inside their eggs. A drier Earth. A world where vertebrates no longer needed swamps to reproduce. A world where giant forests would eventually shrink, atmospheric chemistry would shift, and entirely new ecosystems would rise from the fading remains of the Carboniferous age. And perhaps that is the strangest part of evolution. The future rarely arrives looking powerful at first. Sometimes it begins as a small animal moving silently through wet leaves, while the old rulers of the world still seem invincible overhead. For millions of years, the skies above the Carboniferous forests belonged to giant wings. Enormous dragonfly relatives crossed humid air beneath storm clouds, while vast swamp ecosystems stretched across the planet below them. To any creature living during that era, the dominance of giant arthropods may have felt permanent, as stable and natural as birds feel to modern humans today. But Earth's history has a strange pattern that repeats again and again. Entire worlds can appear eternal right before they begin disappearing. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that extinction does not always arrive as sudden catastrophe. Sometimes a planet simply becomes less welcoming. one slow environmental shift at a time, until organisms perfectly adapted to one version of Earth suddenly find themselves trapped inside another. The disappearance of the giant winged insects may have unfolded exactly that way. There was likely no single day when the skies suddenly emptied, no instant collapse, no dramatic ending visible from one generation to the next. Instead, the Carboniferous world itself slowly began changing beneath them. The endless swamp forests that once stabilized humid ecosystems started fragmenting in many regions as climates shifted and continents continued colliding into the growing supercontinent Pangaea. Mountain ranges rose where shallow seas once existed. Rainfall patterns changed. Some wetlands dried or became seasonal. The dense tropical environments that supported enormous arthropods no longer stretched endlessly across the globe with the same stability they once had. And because those giant insects evolved inside highly specific atmospheric and ecological conditions, even relatively gradual changes may have become devastating over geological timescales. One of the most widely discussed explanations involves oxygen itself. During the peak Carboniferous period, atmospheric oxygen may have exceeded 30%, though exact estimates remain debated. Higher oxygen concentrations likely allowed arthropods to support larger bodies, because their respiratory systems rely heavily on passive diffusion through internal air tubes. But as the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian and environmental conditions changed, oxygen levels appear to have declined. The atmosphere was no longer as favorable for giant arthropods as it once had been. At first glance, that seems like a simple answer. Oxygen drops, giant insects disappear. But the deeper scientists look, the more complicated the story becomes. Some large arthropods survived for considerable time even after oxygen levels began changing. Meanwhile, not every insect group responded the same way. That suggests atmospheric chemistry alone may not fully explain what happened. Ecosystems were changing in multiple directions simultaneously. And once those shifts began overlapping, the world that created giant winged insects slowly unraveled around them. One of the most important changes may have been the rise of new vertebrate competitors and predators. Early reptiles and reptile-like amniotes were spreading into habitats increasingly independent from swamps and wetlands. As these vertebrates diversified, terrestrial ecosystems became more complex and aggressive. Giant insects no longer occupied skies and forests with so little competition. Faster hunters evolved. More mobile predators appeared. Food webs changed. Some scientists suspect that even before true flying vertebrates evolved, growing vertebrate diversity on land may have altered enough ecological relationships to pressure giant arthropod populations. Smaller insects often reproduce quickly and adapt efficiently to changing environments. But giant forms usually require more stable conditions and greater energy investment. In unstable ecosystems, gigantism can become a liability instead of an advantage. And instability was spreading across the late Carboniferous world. Climate fluctuations intensified in some regions as glaciation expanded across parts of the southern hemisphere. Sea levels rose and fell repeatedly. Coastal swamps vanished in some areas, while new environments formed elsewhere. Entire forests that once stretched continuously across tropical lowlands became fragmented into separated ecosystems. That fragmentation may have been especially dangerous for giant arthropods dependent on humidity and stable atmospheric conditions. Modern insects often survive environmental change through flexibility, migration, or rapid reproduction. But larger-bodied species usually reproduce more slowly and require larger habitats to sustain stable populations. The giant griffinflies and massive arthropods of the Carboniferous may have struggled to adapt quickly enough as their world became increasingly unstable around them. And then there is the deeper possibility that gigantism itself trapped these creatures inside a very narrow evolutionary window. Large wings, enormous bodies, and oxygen-dependent respiratory systems worked beautifully under Carboniferous conditions. But those same adaptations may have reduced flexibility once the environment shifted. Evolution often rewards specialization in stable environments because specialization increases efficiency. Yet specialized organisms also become vulnerable when conditions change too far beyond the range they evolved to handle. The giant insects were extraordinarily successful within the world that created them. The problem was that Earth eventually stopped being that world. There is something strangely melancholic about imagining this transformation happening slowly enough that no creature would ever recognize the scale of what was occurring. One generation of giant insects still hatched beneath humid forests, much like the generations before it. The skies still carried storms. The swamps still breathed mist into the atmosphere. But somewhere, across millions of years, the forests became thinner in certain regions. Oxygen declined slightly. Seasons grew harsher. New predators spread into habitats once dominated by arthropods. The world did not end all at once. It simply drifted away from the conditions giant insects needed to remain giants. Fossil evidence preserves fragments of this transition, but like so much of deep time, the details remain incomplete. Some species vanish from the record gradually. Others disappear abruptly in certain regions, while surviving longer elsewhere. Paleontologists continue debating exactly how fast these changes unfolded and which environmental pressures mattered most. The fossil record itself creates challenges because delicate insect bodies preserve poorly compared to bones or shells. Entire lineages may have vanished without leaving clear traces behind. That uncertainty leaves room for multiple interpretations. Perhaps oxygen decline was the dominant force. Perhaps ecological competition mattered more. Perhaps changing climate patterns fragmented giant arthropod populations beyond recovery. Or perhaps all of these pressures combined into a slow-moving collapse no single cause can fully explain on its own. Yet, regardless of the exact mechanism, the outcome remains one of the most dramatic atmospheric shifts in the history of terrestrial life. Earth lost an entire category of animal scale that once seemed perfectly normal. Today, the skies no longer belong to giant arthropods because the planet itself no longer supports the conditions that made them possible. And perhaps that realization changes the way we think about nature. Modern ecosystems often feel fixed and permanent, because humans experience only brief slices of time. But the Carboniferous reminds us that entire biological realities can appear and disappear depending on atmospheric chemistry, climate patterns, and evolutionary timing. Giant insects were not evolutionary mistakes. They were successful products of a very specific Earth. Once that Earth changed, their dominance faded with it. There is also a strange irony in what replaced them. The small, reptile-like creatures, quietly spreading through late Carboniferous environments, would eventually give rise to vertebrate dynasties far larger and more powerful than any arthropod Earth ever produced. Dinosaurs would later dominate continents. Pterosaurs would eventually conquer the skies. Birds would inherit the air long after giant insects vanished. In a sense, the Carboniferous world was watching one kind of evolutionary empire slowly fall, while another began rising almost invisibly beneath it. Yet for all their disappearance, the giant insects never fully vanished from human imagination. Modern dragonflies still carry echoes of their ancient relatives in the shape of their wings and the precision of their flight. Millipedes still move with the same rhythmic motion their gigantic ancestors once used beneath swamp forests hundreds of millions of years ago. Tiny fragments of that ancient world remain alive, reduced in scale, but not erased entirely. And maybe that is part of what makes the Carboniferous so haunting. It was not a fantasy world disconnected from the present. It was an earlier version of Earth whose biological experiments still cast shadows across the modern planet. Long before birds crossed the skies or mammals ruled the land, giant arthropods once moved through oxygen-rich air above endless forests, believing perhaps in the silent, instinctive way all life believes, that their world would continue forever. The world of the Carboniferous is gone, but it never disappeared completely. Pieces of it still exist beneath modern cities, under mountain ranges, inside black seams of coal buried deep underground, and pressed silently into stone where ancient swamps once stood beneath humid skies. Every fossilized leaf imprint, every giant arthropod trackway, every chunk of coal burned in a power plant carries fragments of a vanished Earth that modern civilization unknowingly inherited. And perhaps the strangest part is how ordinary these remnants can seem now. Humans walk across Carboniferous history constantly. Without realizing, they are standing on the compressed remains of forests older than the dinosaurs. Entire industrial revolutions were fueled by ecosystems that no longer exist anywhere on the planet. In a sense, the Carboniferous world never truly died. It was buried, compressed, transformed, and eventually pulled back into the modern world in forms its original inhabitants could never have imagined. Coal is one of the clearest examples of this connection. To most people, coal appears as little more than dark rock, industrial fuel extracted from deep underground. But coal is not truly stone in the way granite or basalt are stone. It is ancient biological material, the compressed residue of Carboniferous forests accumulated over millions of years inside wetlands where decay slowed beneath oxygen-poor conditions. Every coal seam represents unimaginable quantities of plant life that once grew beneath swamp skies filled with giant insects. In some places, entire layers of forests collapsed into waterlogged environments and became buried before fully decomposing. Over immense spans of time, pressure and heat transformed that buried organic material into coal deposits stretching across continents. When humans later mined and burned those deposits, they released carbon stored since the Carboniferous back into the atmosphere. It is an almost surreal connection across deep time. Modern industry partially runs on the remains of a prehistoric swamp world. Some scientists have even described coal as fossilized sunlight, because the energy stored inside it originally came from photosynthesis performed by ancient plants hundreds of millions of years ago. Yet coal preserves more than energy. Sometimes it preserves glimpses of the forests themselves. In certain coal mines and exposed rock layers, fossilized bark patterns from lepidodendron trees still appear in astonishing detail. Ancient root systems spread across stone surfaces like frozen shadows of vanished wetlands. Spores from Carboniferous plants survive trapped inside sediments so old that human civilization occupies only an invisible fraction of the time separating their world from ours. Paleontologists studying these fossils often describe a strange feeling when walking through old mining sites, because the evidence of the Carboniferous can appear suddenly and unexpectedly. A wall of black rock breaks open, revealing impressions of giant fern fronds or scale tree bark preserved for over 300 million years. For a moment, the swamp world surfaces again before disappearing back into darkness. And then there are the trackways. Some of the most haunting Carboniferous fossils are not bodies at all, but traces of movement. Giant arthropods trackways preserved in ancient mud record the exact paths enormous segmented creatures once followed across wet forest floors. The animals themselves are long gone, yet their movement remains frozen in stone. In places like Scotland and parts of North America, fossilized footprints from early vertebrates and giant arthropods reveal entire ecosystems interacting across ancient shorelines and wetlands. These traces feel strangely intimate compared to bones. A skeleton tells you something existed. A trackway tells you it was alive and moving through its world at a specific moment in time. One step after another across soft Carboniferous mud beneath towering forests and humid skies. There is something almost unsettling about that kind of preservation. The animal vanished, the forest vanished, even the atmosphere changed. But a brief motion survived long enough for humans to discover it hundreds of millions of years later. Fossil insects from the Carboniferous are even more extraordinary because their delicate wings, occasionally preserved in fine sediments, reveal details so intricate they still resemble modern insect anatomy. Vein patterns from giant dragonflies spread across stone slabs like dark, stained glass. Some specimens preserve wing structures with such clarity that paleontologists can compare flight adaptations to modern dragonflies. Yet the scale remains deeply strange. Modern dragonflies suddenly begin looking like reduced echoes of something much older and larger. These fossils create a peculiar emotional effect because they collapse time. The Carboniferous stops feeling like an abstract prehistoric era and begins feeling physically real. Giant insects once existed not in myth, but in ecosystems connected directly to the rocks beneath modern human cities. Fossils from this era also continue reshaping scientific understanding in unexpected ways. Early interpretations of Carboniferous ecosystems often imagined simpler food webs or relatively static swamp environments. But each new discovery complicates the picture. Fossilized tree stumps reveal hidden animal shelters. Microscopic analysis of spores helps reconstruct climate fluctuations. Chemical signatures trapped inside rocks provide clues about atmospheric oxygen levels and ancient wildfires. Even charcoal fragments preserved in Carboniferous sediments reveal that fires repeatedly swept through portions of these supposedly waterlogged worlds. The more scientists uncover, the more dynamic and unstable the Carboniferous appears. It was never a still swamp, frozen in time. It was a changing planet, experimenting with atmospheric chemistry, giant arthropods, expanding forests, and new vertebrate lineages, all at once. Some researchers believe many Carboniferous species remain undiscovered because fossil preservation favors certain environments over others. Swamps preserve plant material well, but upland ecosystems from the same period are less understood. Entire communities of animals may have existed beyond the wetlands while leaving few traces behind. That uncertainty matters because it reminds us how incomplete deep history remains. Even after centuries of paleontology, humans possess only fragments of this ancient world. We reconstruct entire ecosystems from scattered bones, trackways, compressed leaves, and chemical patterns hidden inside rock layers. The Carboniferous survives more like a memory than a complete record, and memories always contain gaps. There is also a deeper irony buried inside these fossils. The Carboniferous world helped shape modern civilization, physically and economically, long after its ecosystems vanished. Coal-powered factories, railroads, steamships, electricity generation, and industrial expansion across much of the modern era. Entire nations grew wealthy using carbon buried by prehistoric swamp forests. Yet the release of that ancient carbon back into the atmosphere is now altering Earth's climate again. In a strange way, the Carboniferous continues influencing planetary systems hundreds of millions of years after the forests themselves disappeared. The atmosphere that once allowed giant insects to thrive became trapped underground, then slowly returned through human industry. Time loops strangely through geology. Ancient ecosystems never fully stop affecting the future. And perhaps that is why Carboniferous fossils feel different from many other prehistoric remains. Dinosaur fossils often inspire awe through size and spectacle. Carboniferous fossils inspire something quieter and stranger. They reveal a world that operated under unfamiliar atmospheric rules, where giant arthropods moved through forests unlike any modern ecosystem, and where the buried remains of those forests would eventually help power human civilization. It is not just a story about extinction. It is a story about continuity across impossible stretches of time. Every coal seam, fossil wing, or ancient trackway becomes evidence that the modern world is physically connected to ecosystems unimaginably older than humanity itself. Somewhere deep underground, beneath roads, buildings, and cities filled with electric light, the Carboniferous still waits in silence. Forests compressed into black stone, giant wings preserved in shale, footprints hardened in ancient mud, and all of it remains as proof that long before humans imagined lost worlds filled with monsters and giant creatures, Earth had already lived through one. Imagine stepping outside late at night into a modern city, expecting the familiar silence of distant traffic and cool air, only to hear something else moving overhead. Not birds, not airplanes. A deep, rhythmic flutter passes across the darkness above the streetlights, heavy enough to sound almost mechanical, like fabric snapping in slow motion high in the sky. Then another follows, and another. Shapes move briefly through the glow of the clouds before disappearing again into the night. In another version of Earth, one where the Carboniferous world never truly collapsed, this might have felt completely ordinary. Giant winged arthropods could still dominate parts of the atmosphere, moving through ecosystems shaped by oxygen levels and evolutionary pressures radically different from the modern world humans inherited. And while this idea sounds like science fiction at first, it actually emerges from a very real scientific question hidden beneath the history of the Carboniferous itself. If atmospheric chemistry, climate patterns, and ecological competition had evolved differently, could giant insects have remained part of Earth's ecosystems far longer than they did? The answer is uncertain, but the possibility opens a fascinating window into how fragile the modern world truly is. Humans often assume the present form of nature was inevitable, as though mammals were always destined to dominate the land while birds ruled the skies. But the Carboniferous tells a different story. For millions of years, giant arthropods thrived successfully under atmospheric conditions unlike those of today. Their disappearance was not necessarily because insects were inferior life forms. The planet itself changed around them. So the moment you ask what would happen if that change never fully occurred, the entire trajectory of Earth's history begins shifting into unfamiliar territory. If oxygen levels had remained significantly higher for tens or hundreds of millions of additional years, arthropod physiology may have continued supporting much larger body sizes than modern ecosystems allow. Giant dragonfly relatives might have diversified into new aerial niches long before birds evolved. Massive ground-dwelling arthropods could have remained dominant in humid forests. Entire ecosystems may have continued favoring invertebrate gigantism rather than gradually transferring ecological dominance toward vertebrates. And once you begin extending those possibilities through deep time, the world starts becoming almost unrecognizable. Forests themselves might look different under those conditions. Higher oxygen concentrations influence fire behavior, plant growth, and atmospheric chemistry in complex ways. Scientists still debate today. Some researchers suggest Earth cannot sustain extremely elevated oxygen indefinitely because wildfire feedback systems eventually regulate atmospheric balance. In other words, once oxygen climbs too high, fires become more frequent and intense, preventing unlimited accumulation. But if Earth somehow stabilized at moderately elevated oxygen levels without triggering runaway ecological collapse, giant arthropods may have retained advantages far longer than they actually did. Humid tropical ecosystems could remain especially important in such a world, supporting large-bodied insects and segmented arthropods across enormous swamp or rainforest regions. The atmosphere itself might even feel different to human lungs, denser and richer in subtle ways difficult to describe. Yet the truly unsettling possibility is not simply that giant insects would survive. It is that their continued existence could reshape the evolution of everything else around them. Modern vertebrate dominance developed partly within ecosystems where arthropods occupied relatively limited size ranges. But if giant flying insects remained powerful aerial predators, early vertebrate flight evolution might have unfolded differently. Birds may have faced far greater competition for the skies. Some lineages might never have diversified successfully at all. Even the rise of mammals could have been altered by ecosystems filled with large arthropod predators and scavengers, occupying niches mammals later inherited. The Carboniferous world was not merely an earlier stage leading inevitably toward the present. It represented one possible direction life on Earth could take under certain environmental conditions. And that realization changes how we think about evolution itself. There is no guarantee nature had to become what it is now. Imagine tropical forests in such a world. Nighttime would feel profoundly different. Modern forests already contain immense insect activity, largely hidden by small body size. Scale those ecosystems upward, and the atmosphere itself becomes more physically alive. The soundscape changes first. Large wings create audible pressure through air. Tree trunks vibrate as armored arthropods move across bark. Hunting behavior becomes visible at scales modern humans rarely associate with insects. A dragonfly-sized predator today feels harmless because of its proportions. Increase that same anatomy to the wingspan of a hawk, and suddenly the geometry of nature feels psychologically wrong. Compound eyes reflecting moonlight from giant airborne predators would likely trigger instinctive reactions in mammals, including humans, very different from the way modern insects do. And perhaps that psychological discomfort reveals something important. Humans evolved in ecosystems where arthropods no longer dominated the upper limits of terrestrial body size. Our instincts formed inside a mammal and vertebrate world. A surviving Carboniferous-style ecosystem might feel deeply unnatural to us, even if it functioned perfectly well biologically. There is also the question of human civilization itself. Could cities develop normally in a world where giant arthropods remained widespread? Possibly, though infrastructure and architecture might evolve differently. Urban lighting would attract enormous nocturnal insects. Agriculture would face different ecological pressures. Transportation systems in tropical regions might need protection against large flying arthropods during seasonal migrations or breeding periods. Entire cultural mythologies could emerge around species humans today only know from fossils. Ancient religions might depict giant dragonfly predators not as monsters from imagination, but as ordinary parts of nature. Children growing up in such a world would learn early which forests become dangerous after dark and which wetlands fill with enormous winged hunters during humid seasons. Human psychology itself might shift around constant coexistence with large invertebrates. Yet even in this speculative world, uncertainty remains everywhere, because ecosystems are never shaped by one variable alone. Elevated oxygen alone would not automatically preserve giant arthropods forever. Climate fluctuations, continental drift, disease, evolutionary competition, and countless other factors continuously reshape life over geological timescales. It is entirely possible that even under favorable atmospheric conditions, vertebrates would eventually outcompete giant insects in many environments anyway. Birds possess highly efficient respiratory systems and extraordinary flight capabilities. Mammals evolved rapid metabolisms, intelligence, and complex social behaviors. Giant arthropods may still have struggled against these advantages eventually. But perhaps the balance would look different. Maybe some lineages survive alongside modern vertebrates instead of disappearing almost entirely. Maybe isolated rainforests or equatorial wetlands still contain giant griffinfly descendants gliding above dark rivers beneath dense canopies. Maybe enormous armored arthropods still move through swamp systems at night, while humans avoid certain regions after sunset. The deeper you follow these possibilities, the clearer one truth becomes. Earth's history was never inevitable. Tiny shifts in atmosphere, climate, or evolutionary timing could have produced a planet both familiar and profoundly alien at the same time. And perhaps that is the real lesson hidden inside the Carboniferous world. The giant insects disappeared not because nature was progressing toward a predetermined final form, but because planetary conditions changed in ways that favored different life strategies. Evolution does not move toward perfection. It moves through opportunity. The Carboniferous offered one extraordinary opportunity for giant arthropods to dominate the skies and forests of Earth. Later eras offered different opportunities to reptiles, mammals, and eventually humans. But somewhere inside coal seams, fossil wings, and ancient trackways, evidence still remains that another version of Earth once existed briefly, one where giant insects ruled humid skies beneath oxygen-rich clouds. And when you realize how close that world once came to permanence, modern nature begins feeling less stable, less inevitable, and far stranger than it first appears. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight on Sleepy Earth Channel. If you enjoyed this journey into the ancient world, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment telling me what topic you'd like to explore next. I'd love to hear your ideas. Wishing you a peaceful night, good luck, and I'll see you again in the next adventure.